engine coughed like it was giving up on life, right there in the middle of a sunlit roadside, with heat shimmering off the asphalt and a long line of impatient cars stretching behind her. She gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding, watching. Her entire carefully controlled world began to unravel in broad daylight. She had built empires, signed deals worth millions, and commanded rooms full of powerful people. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Her car had died, and she was completely alone. A dusty pickup truck slowed down behind her, its brakes squeaking as if they too had seen better days. From it stepped a man who looked like life had tested him more than most. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hands rough with years of work, and his face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned to keep going no matter what. He hesitated for just a second, glancing at the line of cars, then at the woman stranded beside the road, before walking forward with a calm, steady determination. Before we continue, take a second to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Home with Dad if you believe that even the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's entire life, and maybe even their future. His name was Rayan Iqbal, a single father who had learned to rebuild his life piece by piece after it had fallen apart years ago. Every morning, he woke before sunrise, packed his daughter's lunch, braided her hair with clumsy but improving hands, and dropped her off at school before heading to whatever job he could find that day. Some days he worked construction, other days he repaired engines in a cramped garage he rented on the edge of town. Nothing in his life was stable except one thing: his promise to never let his daughter feel the absence of the mother they had lost. The woman standing by the broken car watched him approach with guarded eyes. She was used to control, to precision, to everything going exactly as planned. Being stranded like this, exposed and dependent on a stranger, made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain. Rayan didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply looked under the hood, listened to the struggling engine, and nodded to himself like he already understood the problem. The heat pressed down around them, but he worked without complaint, his movements careful and practiced. There was no arrogance in him, no attempt to impress, just quiet competence. She observed him more closely now. There was something different about him, something rare. People around her usually wanted something: approval, money, opportunity. But this man seemed to want nothing at all. Time passed in silence except for the occasional metallic clink of tools. Cars continued to honk in frustration, but he ignored them. Eventually, the engine came back to life with a steady, reassuring hum. The sound felt like relief itself. She exhaled slowly, almost surprised. For the first time that day, her control returned, but it came with an unfamiliar emotion: gratitude. Rayan stepped back, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. He didn't linger or expect praise. He simply nodded once, as if the job had always been meant to be done, and turned to leave. She stopped him, not with urgency, but with something softer, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Her name was Meher Awan, though he didn't know it yet. To the world, she was the invisible force behind one of the most powerful corporate networks in the region. Entire industries shifted when she made decisions. Careers were built or destroyed depending on her approval. And yet, standing there, in the midday sun, she felt strangely small compared to the quiet dignity of the man who had just helped her without hesitation. She offered him money. It was instinctive, almost automatic. Rayan shook his head gently. He didn't refuse out of pride or stubbornness, but because, to him, kindness wasn't something to be sold. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile and said he just hoped she got where she needed to go safely. Then he walked back to his truck, climbed in, and drove away, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. Meher stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle behind him. For the first time in years, she felt unsettled, not because something had gone wrong, but because something had felt unexpectedly right. Days later, Rayan stood in a sharply lit office hallway, his hands clasped together, his nerves barely held. In check. He had been called in for a job interview, one that could change everything for him and his daughter. The company was massive, powerful, and known for offering opportunities that didn't come twice in a lifetime. But there was a problem. He didn't belong there, not really. His clothes were simple, his experience scattered, his confidence worn thin by years of rejection. Still, he stood there because he had learned long ago that showing up, even when you felt out of place, was sometimes the only chance you had. Inside the building, decisions were being made about him without his knowledge. Files were being reviewed, backgrounds checked, and futures quietly weighed, and at the center of it all was Meher Awan. She sat at the head of a long conference table, her presence commanding the room without effort. People listened when she spoke. They always did. When Rayan's file was placed in front of her, she didn't expect anything unusual. It was just another candidate, another decision in a long list of decisions. But then she saw his name. Something in her chest tightened slightly, though she couldn't immediately explain why. She opened the file, scanning the details, his work history, his references, his gaps. Then she saw a photograph, and everything clicked. The roadside, the heat, the quiet man who had fixed her car and asked for nothing in return. For a moment, the room faded around her. Out of all the people in the city, it was him. The man who had helped her without knowing who she was now stood on the edge of a decision that could define his future. And she was the one holding that decision. But instead of reacting immediately, she leaned back slightly, studying the file with a deeper focus. She didn't want to act out of impulse. She had built her entire life on discipline, on fairness, on making choices that were calculated and justified. Yet something inside her resisted the usual process, because this wasn't just about qualifications anymore. This was about character. Rayan was eventually called into the interview room. He walked in with the same quiet composure he had shown on the roadside, though inside, he felt the weight of everything pressing against him. His daughter's future, his own failures, the chance to finally create stability. He didn't know she was there. Not yet. Meher watched him carefully as he answered questions. He didn't speak like someone trying to impress. He spoke like someone who had lived through struggle and learned from it. There was honesty in his words, even when those words revealed imperfections, and that honesty was rare. As the interview ended, he thanked them simply and walked out, unaware that his life had just crossed paths with something far greater than he imagined. Meher remained silent for a long time after he left. The room waited for her decision. She could have dismissed him easily. His profile didn't match their usual standards. There were safer choices, more predictable ones, but none of them had stopped on the side of the road for a stranger. None of them had shown kindness without expecting reward, and that mattered more than any resume ever could. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Not just in Rayan's life, but in Meher's as well. She found herself thinking about that moment again and again. Not because it was dramatic or extraordinary, but because it was simple and genuine in a way her world rarely allowed. She had built an empire, but somewhere along the way, she had lost touch with the kind of humanity Rayan represented so effortlessly. And, now, unexpectedly, it had found its way back into her life. Rayan received a call a few days later. He had been selected, not for a small role, not for a temporary position, but for an opportunity that could change everything. He didn't understand why. He only knew that, for the first time in a long time, life had opened a door instead of closing one. As he stood there holding the phone, his daughter running toward him with excitement, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the woman who had once stood helpless beside a broken car was now quietly shaping the road ahead of him. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude alone, but because she had seen something in him that the world often overlooked, and she wasn't going to let it go to waste. As Rayan stepped into his new life, challenges still waited for him. Nothing would be easy. Nothing ever was. But this time, he wasn't alone, because somewhere, behind the walls of power and influence, someone believed in him, and sometimes, that belief is all it takes to change everything. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and comment, because your support keeps these stories alive and reaching people who need them most. And before we end, here's a special request. Comment, kindness comes back. If you believe that what you give to the world, no matter how small, always finds its way back to you, because in the end, it wasn't just a car that got fixed that day. It was a future.